This is episode 31, and today we're going to be talking about clarity. So, there's two aspects that I want to touch today on clarity. One is clarity of your vision as an entrepreneur, and two is clarity of your product and clearing up confusion. So, first off, let's talk about you as an entrepreneur and your clarity uh, and where you want your business to go and how you're going to get there. Obviously, the easiest way to get started on this is by writing down your goals, where you want to be, where you're headed, what you want the end result to be, and then, of course, most importantly, breaking it down into shorter term goals, of a year, 6 months, per month, per week, and then not necessarily a goal list per day, but really more so a to-do list per day. So we want to have that clarity when we talk about our business, but we also want to make sure that we write this down and that it's something that we can revisit because it's also something that may adjust over time. Most businesses, they don't go in a straight line up, right? Your journey essentially goes up and down and around and back and forth, and obviously there are businesses that stick to the same product that they launched with, but some businesses, end up having a different product or service than they even launched with. So your vision and your end goal and how you're going to get there is something that definitely should be edited. So you want to, write that all down, put it somewhere, and even revisit it when it's necessary to keep that clarity, right? You want to have clarity in the beginning of the vision, where you want to go, how you think you're going to get there, and then everything's going to go crazy once you start down that path. And so you want to revisit that and update it to make sure that you're keeping clarity of where you're currently going now after XYZ has happened and how you think you're going to get to the end vision. And a lot of the times the vision will change. If your product or service changes, you kind of go, wow, I think with this one we can eventually get to this point, and then we could do this, and then we could do this. So those are things that you want to change. I think in general, so many entrepreneurs, I think, underestimate where you can be taken when you have an open mind. Where your business may end up taking you may have nothing to do with what you started out with. And you have to keep that open mind for new products or services to come in, or for customers or the marketplace to tell you that something works, for customers to be asking for an upgrade or a certain feature of a product or service. And then that could change your whole entire business. So you have to keep an open mind. You have to be willing to, kind of adjust as you go. And again, these things should be written down kind of as your vision, as your goals, and those should be updated as things change and shift. And, you kind of maybe go a different direction or go in the same direction, but have a different route of getting there that you've seen proven out so far. So we want to have a lot of clarity on where we're going and how we're going to get there. So that's the first part of what we're talking about today is the actual clarity of you and your business and where it's going. Now, the second part of clarity that I want to talk about here is the actual idea or the product or service. So keep in mind that no matter how good your product or service is, if people don't understand what you do, they're not going to buy it, right? So, very important that we make things as simple as possible, especially in the beginning, especially when we're in a situation where maybe nobody knows our brand yet, and we're new to the industry or new to the game, or just a new business in general. We want to make sure that it's clear and concise, that our offering makes sense, that it can be seen and understood instantly, especially when we're talking about something that we're going to need to run ads for. It needs to be something that somebody can scroll past and in 2 seconds understand the gist of it and understand if they want to, look into it further. So we need to keep things very simple. If your customers cannot understand your product or service, they're not going to buy it. And if your customers cannot understand your pitch to pitch them your product or services, they're not going to buy it. So we need clarity. We don't want too many, features. We don't want too many uh, things going on here. A lot of the times we need to keep it simple, especially in the beginning of our business or our product or our service. You know, confusion doesn't necessarily sound bad, it just takes too long. So sometimes you may say, well, this isn't confusing. I have all the details here, and it's so easy for them to see all these details. And then if they click here, they can read the full explanation and they can get detailed steps and all that kind of stuff, right? Well, just because you have clarity available doesn't mean that it's clear or that they're going to get clarity. One thing that we all know is that by human nature, especially nowadays, we're all kind of lazy, right? We don't want to read a bunch and look into things. We spend most of our days watching videos, and interacting with things that aren't having to read hundreds and hundreds of words, especially if it's something that we're not needing to do, right? If we're talking about us putting our money into somebody's hands for a product or service, the last thing we want to do is read a bunch of words and go into depth of reading a bunch of stuff to figure out if we want to give our money to this person, right, to purchase this product or service. So just keep that in mind that confusion, it's not that it's necessarily a bad pitch or that your product or service is bad. A lot of the times it's just too much, too many details, or too hard to go get all the details that are needed. And so you want to take a little bit of a step back and, kind of get your elevator pitch down and then make sure that you can advertise with that elevator pitch, have the essence of that elevator pitch in your actual advertisements so that you can convert people easily. Because one of the hardest things about converting customers is if there's too confusing of an offer, if there's too many words, if it takes too much to get your product or services point across to your potential customers, you're just going to keep churning ad money. It's just not something that's going to ever catch on, really. It's got to be simple, especially in now, today's day and age where everything, everyone's attention span is very short. It's got to be something super quick, easy, and, let them know what your product or service does and how easy it is to purchase it. That's another thing, making sure that your product or service is easy to actually purchase, right? So if you're running ads, a lot of the times it's easy. If you're running ads, a lot of the times it's easy to get the person to click on the link. So say you're running a Facebook lead ad. A lot of the times it's easy for them to click on the link and give their information for the Facebook lead ad. So now you have their info, but it's not easy to get them to actually purchase the product or service after that, right? You're going to need to follow up with the automated emails and the automated texts, and you're going to need to reach out via a phone call. And most importantly, in this whole process, you have to have the place for them to actually purchase that product or service. And how are you getting them there? And what is on that page? And how are you explaining to them what's going on? These are all things that need to be crystal clear, because having a clear ad is the first part. But then once they click on the ad and you get their information, how are you reaching out to get them to actually buy the product or service? And in what form are they doing that? Are you sending them an invoice and then you're following up to explain it? Or are you sending them to a landing page that already explains it and then you're kind of just following up to see if they checked out that landing page yet where they can actually purchase the product or service? So there's a lot of layers to this that we need to make sure that all of those layers we try to make as least complicated as possible. It should be as least complicated as possible to see your offering and click the ad to get more information. And then it should be as easy as possible to actually buy the product or service after that, and as easy as it can be to see more details on the product or service or get questions answered about that product or service if they have any questions. Now, the easiest way to make sure that they can ask all the questions they need is to call them, right? What's easier than you getting a phone call, right? So, yes, your phone number is available, your email is available, they can respond to the text that you're sending and all that kind of stuff. But that still takes a trigger on their behalf. The easiest way to make sure you answer any questions they have is for you to call them, and then they're already on the phone and you can answer any question. So, this all goes together here. And the first part of it is clarity with your ads and your offering, and the second part is clarity with the actual avenue that they're going to purchase it through and the purchase process. And then you need clarity on answering any questions that they have. And to do that, you usually want to actually physically call them and get on the phone with them and answer any questions that they have. So I think sometimes when we make a product or a service sound too vague, it might feel a little safe to us as an entrepreneur, saying, well, this can apply to a lot of people, and so I want to market it this way. But I think sometimes that's a mistake. I think sometimes we need to narrow it down and be more specific, because too vague is a little too safe, and specifics sell, right? So we're talking about, my product solves this problem without needing this. That's a perfect example. My product solves X without needing Y, right? You're telling them you're going to solve a simple problem for them, and the solution that they would usually use to solve that problem, they're not going to need. Whether that's, more money that they'd have to spend usually, or they'd need another product or service that's more expensive, or whatever it is. We're talking about very specific things to where somebody gets it in 2 seconds. They can look at an ad and say, oh yeah, that's the problem I have, and yeah, I usually have to do XYZ, but they're saying I won't need to do that. I just need to get their product or service. And so that's a very good example of a quick elevator pitch, something that could be laid out into ads, and something that can be driven home on your landing pages. Something very simple, but very specific. If it's too vague, you don't get that snappiness and that connection right away, of the person that actually needs the product or service. So while being a little more vague may seem a little more safe because you feel like you're going to capture more people in your net, being more specific usually triggers more sales. And specifically telling them this is the exact problem that my product or service is solving, and this is why you should use it over the other options there are to solve that problem. you know, when things are too complicated, I think as entrepreneurs, sometimes we do that. Sometimes we overcomplicate things because we're in it. Sometimes we have to kind of take a step back and look at it from a customer standpoint. But we know all the intricacies. So a lot of times when we're writing these things out, or we're making landing pages, or making the emails to send to the clients, or whatever it is, we'll put so much information because we know what all that information means. But remember, the customer doesn't. They're just a customer. And so I think we get wrapped up a little bit too much in it because we're in it. And so we complicate things a little too much sometimes. More information is not always good. For a customer that has nothing to do with your business and they're just trying to be a customer, a lot of the times more information is bad. You want to make sure that they have the info they need to use your product or service. You want to make sure that they have the avenues where they can get help if they need that product or service, but don't overcomplicate it. I think as entrepreneurs, we do that a lot. It's just something in our nature because we're so close to the business. Sometimes I think we want to answer everybody's questions beforehand. So we want to say, oh, I don't want anyone to have to call the office. So I want to give them all the information they're going to need right here so that they never have to call the office. Well, that's probably going to create even more questions, right? Um, Now, if this is on the front end, if we're talking about the front end of sales, a lot of the times when we overcomplicate things, we don't realize that we're pushing sales away. A lot of the times people don't say no to our product or services, they just kind of drift away. Now, especially if you're in any lead type business where we're collecting leads and then trying to sell them on something, you know that this is very true. Most of the time people don't actually say no, I'm not interested. Most of the time they just kind of drift away. And confusion has to do a lot with that. Or I guess that has to do a lot with confusion, I should say. Confusion can cause people to just kind of drift away, and instead of saying no to your product or service, they're kind of just lost in your shuffle, lost in your CRM, and they just kind of drift away and they're never actually going to buy it because it's just too much or it's too confusing or it's not clear to them. And then they just check out. So I think as entrepreneurs, I think we lose more business to confusion and people drifting away than we do to people seeing the offer and just saying, no, I'm not interested. Most of the battle is getting the offer in front of them in a clear enough way for them to make the decision, do I want it or do I not? That's 90% of the game. 90% of the sales is getting the information in front of the person in a way that they can understand it so that they can make the decision if they want to purchase it or not. So the first step is getting in front of them. That's what most entrepreneurs don't do in the first place is advertise or do whatever it takes to get your product or service in front of someone. From there, it needs to be clear. There needs to be clarity in your offering. They need to actually be able to see in a matter of seconds if it's something that they need or want. And then, of course, you need to be, you know, following up. So you need their information in your CRM and all that kind of good stuff, and calls, texts, emails, making sure to answer any questions that they do have, anything that they're not clear on. So clarity has a lot to do with actually converting sales as opposed to letting people just kind of drift away and become another name in your CRM because things weren't really clear enough for them and they didn't get the actual clear information in front of them for them to make a decision on yes or no. Okay, now let's go ahead and talk about how to simplify your message. So as an entrepreneur, a lot of the times we put too much details into things, we kind of overcomplicate things. I would say take the classic elevator pitch and put it on paper as far as in your advertisements, in your marketing. You should be thinking elevator pitch and even a more shortened version of that because today's attention span is, you know, shorter than ever. So it's even more than an elevator pitch. I would call it a social media pitch, right? A real pitch, whatever you want to call it. Something so quick that it can grab somebody's attention when they're scrolling through social media is what most of us need. That's what most of our businesses need. Obviously, some people don't make their sales through social media or advertising. There are certain companies that don't, but for most of us, especially nowadays, we need advertising and we need um, marketing that people can see and understand very quickly while they are scrolling through social media or whatever it is, a website that they're on. So take that elevator pitch that you would normally, used to be saying in person to people and simplify it even more, shorten it even more so that you can have your advertising pitch or your social media pitch, something that's super easy, super clear, super concise, and something that's visually appeasing that can grab somebody's attention so that you can get them the information you need to to make sure that they understand what it is that you're offering and then they can make a decision on whether or not they want to purchase it. All right. With that being said, I have some questions here. So let's go ahead and get into questions. Remember, we do stream this live on all of the different platforms. So you can put any comments there. We can answer your questions live. And you can also send any questions you have in advance to my DM at Kyle Hiersche or at Founding Without Funding. We'll go ahead and get into some questions that I was sent here already. So Alex is asking, people always ask what I do and I end up rambling. How do you fix that? That's a great question. I think as entrepreneurs, a lot of us ramble on when somebody asks us what we do. Now, there's two aspects to this. For one, you could be talking about somebody asking you what you do that you're not going to make sales to. Maybe there's a family member and they're just asking what you're doing. A lot of times we're super excited about what we're doing, and we want to be super excited about what we're doing. So rambling on in that case, not as big of a deal. But rambling on as far as to clients, potential vendors, potential partners, we want to work on that. As entrepreneurs, we do tend to talk a lot and be excited and maybe even indulge the information that we shouldn't, right? Maybe sometimes we'll even say info that we shouldn't because we're so excited and we're talking about things. or even end up giving somebody kind of a competitive advantage because we talk a little bit too much about something. So as entrepreneurs, we do need to work on that and keep things a little more simple. So if you are talking to somebody who's a potential client or partner or anything like that, definitely try to work on that. Don't ramble on. Try to be clear and concise in our words. And that's something you can get like training on. There's YouTube videos and different speakers that help you uh, talk more clear and concise and work on that. So you could also check those out. Okay, question from Laura. How do you explain your business without oversimplifying it? I think it's hard to oversimplify your business when you're talking to a client or a potential customer. I think it's easy to overcomplicate your business when talking to a potential client, but it's pretty hard to oversimplify it because we want to be as simple as possible when we're talking to a potential customer, client, vendor, partner, whatever it is. We want to be as simple as possible. And guess what? If they're not clear on something and they want more detail, they can ask. Let them ask more details. Give them the necessity of what they need to know. What does this product or service do? What can it do for them? And why is it something that they need? And if they have further questions, they can ask. Let's not bombard them with a bunch of information that they didn't ask for. Let's get them the clear, concise details. And then at that point, if they have further questions, they'll ask. And we will go into more detail for them. But no need to complicate it straight out of the gate. It's going to hurt us at the end of the day. Too complicated is not good. The more clarity, the simpler, the better. All right, question here. How do you know when you're unclear versus people just not being interested? A good question. So, how do you know if you're being unclear or if people just are interested in your product or service? I would say the biggest thing is making sure you're getting it in front of them, right? So, if you're getting it in front of enough people in the right way, right? They're seeing your ad, they're clicking your ad, you're following up, you're sending them the emails, the text with all of the information, you're getting on the phone to call them and make sure they got that information. So, if you have 100 people that answered the phone and said, "Yeah, I got the information, I'm just not interested," then you can start looking at that. Okay, it just seems like people are not interested in this. But if they, you know, then it probably needs to be more clear. But if you just haven't got it in front of enough people, you know, then you just don't have the data yet, right? So I would just say that's more of like a market testing of getting your product or service in front of people and then getting their feedback. All right, question here from Dan. How specific is too specific when you're explaining what you do? I don't think it's ever too. I don't think it's ever too specific when explaining what you do. So if you're talking about explaining what you do to people that aren't necessarily customers, you know, I wouldn't be too worried about that. But explaining what your company does or your product or service does to customers, I think be as specific as possible, especially if they've already let you know one of their needs, or if you met them or came across them in a way where they already inquired about one of their needs, then be very specific, tailored to that need that they, you know, that you know about. All right, question from Nina. Is it bad to change how you explain your business as you learn more? No, it's never bad to change things as you learn more. The more you learn, the more you know. So um, I don't think it's ever a problem changing the way you explain your business, changing your pitch, changing your advertising, as long as you're documenting it properly to make sure your conversion rates are staying the same or increasing. But as you learn more about your business, absolutely, it's okay to explain it differently. And I would recommend that you get to explain it more clearly and concisely as time goes on, for sure. All right, question here. What's the biggest clarity mistake you see founders make? I think it's a mistake that I've made a lot, which is just we as entrepreneurs tend to overcomplicate things because we're so close to it and we're so involved in the business and we know all these details. And so we try to get a lot of them across to people and not really realizing that they're just a person, they're just a customer that's scrolling through social media or looking at a website or whatever it is that they're doing. And they don't want all this complicated information. We got to put ourselves in their shoes. us as customers, even when we're entrepreneurs, when we're on the other end of it and we're customers, we don't want to deal with complicated stuff. We don't want to read a bunch of complicated stuff. I want to know what this is, what can it do for me, and why should I purchase this instead of something else. The easier it is to get that information, the more likely I am to purchase that product or service. So as entrepreneurs, I think a lot of the times we need to take a step back, and we also need to put ourselves in a customer's shoes. And not like, oh, if I was a customer of my business, just a customer, period. Just say, as a customer, would I like this experience? When I buy things, what makes me pull the trigger and actually buy them? Is it paragraphs and paragraphs of wording like I currently have on my landing page? Or is it a very simple message? Large graphics, simple message, solve this with this. Typically, it's more clear and concise messaging that makes the sales. All right. Question here. Why do people say they're interested but never follow up? Well, I think, so the question is, why do people say they're interested but never follow up? Well, it's your job as the business to follow up. Don't put that on them. Don't put that on the customer or the client to follow up. It's our job as entrepreneurs, as the business owner, to follow up with them. So I think that's your first problem. If you're waiting for the client to follow up after they've said they're interested, you're already losing. If they've said they're interested, they need to be tagged in your CRM accordingly. They need to be a hot lead, somebody that you're following up with consistently. So that might be your first problem. People are saying they're interested and then they're not following up, and you're just sitting there going, dang, why does everybody say they're interested and not follow up? I just wish everyone who said they're interested would actually purchase the product or service. Then my business would be great. It's all other people's fault. No, we need to take responsibility as the entrepreneur and say, why are people not purchasing this? People keep saying they're interested, but they don't actually follow through. So I need to follow up with them more. And I also need to, when I'm following up with them, making those phone calls and getting out in front of them again, I need to ask, why haven't you purchased it yet? You said you're interested. What can we do to get you to pull the trigger? But also you're getting that feedback of why haven't they actually done it yet, so that we can then take that into consideration and try to implement that in our system to solve that problem in the future. All right, last question here. If someone wanted more clarity this week, what's the first thing they should rewrite? Well, if you want clarity right now, first thing I would do is, again, make sure you have your vision written down. That's the first thing for clarity. Have the vision for your company written down and the vision for your product or service written down, how you're going to get there, and some goals that you need to accomplish to get there. After that, I would start looking to your offerings. I would start looking at your advertisements. I would start looking at your website and your landing pages, your conversion pages, really is what I mean when I say landing pages. Whatever page it is that you're using to convert people into customers, aka whatever page they can pay on, right? So that's the second thing I would look at is, what am I actually currently pushing out there to people, and could that be more clear and concise? I've done this before where I've gone through and said, yeah, I erased 3 paragraphs from a website. Why are these 3 paragraphs of writing here above the button to pay, right? We want to make the pay button above the fold, all that kind of good stuff, the online conversion, teaches you. And like I said, even myself, sometimes you have to go back and say, yeah, that doesn't make sense. Why would I have all that writing there? Why would I be trying to explain this and that? I just need to give a more clear, concise offering to my customers. So, first thing is, do you have the goals and vision written down for your business and for your product or service and how to get there? And then the second thing is, what are you already offering to people? Let's dissect the ads. What do they look like? What's the writing for them? What's the calls to action? Your website, your conversion pages. I would just go through, and probably the first time you're going to go through and just remove a lot. That's kind of the first thing, and then you can kind of go from there. But I'm sure for most of us entrepreneurs, there's always stuff we can remove to make our offerings more simple. All right, with that being said, we will go ahead and wrap it up. That's all of the questions. So thank you everybody for tuning in, and we will see you on the next episode of the Founding Without Funding podcast.